So I can't really talk about Rider without also mentioning ReSharper. ReSharper is an insanely popular Visual Studio extension, also by JetBrains. It adds a lot of very advanced functionality, such as refactoring tools, code analysis, powerful navigation, and much more. And Rider now has all of that ReSharper goodness built in. In fact, the name Rider comes from ReSharper IDE, so RID, Rider. ReSharper has been around a lot longer than Rider, and JetBrains already had their IntelliJ platform, which is what a lot of their existing IDEs are built on. So they were already very experienced with building IDEs. So creating their own .NET IDE with the ReSharper functionality was an obvious evolution. They just needed to take that functionality out of ReSharper so that their new Rider IDE could leverage that functionality. Now, one of the issues with ReSharper is that Visual Studio extensions run in the same process as the Visual Studio IDE. And given both Visual Studio and ReSharper do a lot of stuff, having both in the same process could quite often really slow things down. For Rider, they wanted to move the ReSharper engine into a separate process than the Rider IDE's main UI process. If you have Rider running and look at the processes, you'll actually see two separate processes, one for the UI and one for the backend. This makes a big difference to making Rider as fast as it is, while still leveraging the very powerful functionality that the ReSharper engine provides. Also, because Rider is built on top of this shared IntelliJ platform base, that also means that you're not just limited to .NET stuff. I do full stack development in Rider. For example, one project I work on is an Angular frontend and a .NET backend. I do all these things in Rider, as well as other things like PowerShell scripts, write Kubernetes Helm files, and various other things. So next we're going to take a look at installing Rider and also using the JetBrains toolbox to do this. Okay, so let's have a look at installing Rider. So if you go to jetbrains.com, the first time you visit it, you'll get this cookie policy, and their UI really brings back memories. I think a while back they actually had a cookie policy which was like a terminal in the bottom right-hand corner, which was quite cool. So if we accept that and then go to developer tools, now if you're scanning left to right, you might see RiderFlow first. RiderFlow is basically a plugin for Unity. So ignore that for now, and then go over to here where it says Rider. You then have two download buttons to choose from. I'll go with the nearest, this one. And it's auto-selected Windows, which is my operating system, but you've got Mac and Linux as well. And then you can just download it directly. Another option is to download the JetBrains Toolbox app. And if we go to each, you can see it's available on each one. This is what I would recommend. If you click on here, then it looks like this. It sits in your system tray. I'll show it in a sec. And you can see it manages all your apps and updates as well. And you can download that from here. If I load that up now here, so this is my version. So you can see we've got the ReSharper tools installed, Fleet is JetBrains kind of VS Code alternative. There's a few others, Rider, DataGrip is their kind of database IDE. And you can see I've got an update available, so I can do that just by clicking here, or I can say update all. And you can see there's a list of all the other available applications. So things like their Rust IDE. This is new Aqua. I've not actually tried this. This is an IDE for test automation, a Go IDE, and various others. But you can install these all via this JetBrains Toolbox app. You've also got projects, which shows your past history of projects. I'll collapse that because it's got client projects on. And services, which show things like the data science platform. So Space is their kind of DevOps platform. So if you think about GitHub or Azure DevOps, so it has things like issue management, DevOps pipelines, Git repository hosting, artifact hosting, things like NuGet, NPM, Maven, that kind of thing. So that's what that is. And going back to tools, you can also force a check for updates. And there's a few various settings like this has light mode or dark mode and that kind of thing. So the latest version of Rider has actually only just come out because at the time of recording, .NET 9 has just come out. So if we go to ... and other versions, and sometimes you'd see a version at the top, which is an EAP version. And if I go to Rider next version, we can see a description here. It does say that the early access program is currently closed because Rider has just been released. JetBrains quite often open an early access program, which allows you early access to the next version of Rider. There isn't one available at the moment, but fairly soon there probably will be for the next version. So if you want to play around with their next experimental version and what's upcoming in Rider, then when they open their EAP version, then that will also be available to download in this list. So once you've installed the JetBrains toolbox, you've clicked install next to Rider, it will do the rest for you. And then once it's installed, you can open it up. And in the next section, we're going to do a tour of the UI. So now we're at a point where we can start digging into Rider itself. So once it's installed, when you first run it, this is the page you'll see. If you've used it before, you'll see a list of projects, your past projects here. You can create a new solution or open an existing one. There's also this starter tour down at the bottom, and this is really nice. I won't do it now because I'm going to guide you through the UI, but this is quite an interactive guide and it actually works really nicely. So I'd recommend going through there as well, but we won't do this now because I'm going to talk you through the UI. So what we're going to do, we're going to create a new solution. And for now, I'm just going to arbitrarily just choose a new Blazor app and click create. Using Windows, you quite often get this pop-up at the bottom for a new project saying that Windows Defender might affect your performance and it allows you to configure it to exclude this project's folders. I won't do this now though. So this is the main Rider IDE. Now I've got this in dark mode. If I do the cog at the top right and choose settings, we'll talk about settings later. But if you go to appearance, then we've got dark mode here and we can switch to light mode. For this course, I'm going to use dark mode for two reasons. One, that's what I prefer, that's what I code in. And another, light mode does actually really trigger my migraines very badly. So I don't want that, so I'm going to use dark mode. I will try and make sure that the font is a decent size just to help with accessibility. So if I cancel this and let's have a walk around the UI. So on the left here, we've got the Solution Explorer, which if you've used Visual Studio, you're probably very used to. It's the same kind of concept. If this is hidden, you can click this icon here and you can toggle it here. And you can also see that if you hover over it, it shows you the keyboard shortcut. Now, just like in Visual Studio, top level, you've got your solutions, then you've got projects, and then you've got files inside. We'll talk more about things like dependencies throughout the course. And you've also got the option to right click, say, add a solution folder, which allows you to group your projects. You've got a few options around here. So this is quite useful. Sometimes you can toggle showing all the files versus just the ones that are about this project that are related. This will show all the other files within that file system. You can also change this drop down to be literally the file system. So you can see the main folder structure. You'll notice here that there's this idea folder. Now JetBrains, I believe for all their IDEs, create this .idea folder and it's got various different configuration files in. Some of them you don't want to be checked into source control. Some you might do if you want to share some of these settings with different members of the team. There is this example gitignore file. So quite often, a lot of people would just in their gitignore completely ignore the idea folder. But if you want to be more specific, this is quite a good example. So going back to Rider, if we collapse this, we've got other options. If I change this back to Solution Explorer, we've got other options. So we can find throughout, we can collapse and expand everything. In this drop down, you can choose the behavior. So you can change a few settings, the appearance. So it mentions about hiding scratch and consoles, which is this. And later on in the course, we'll talk about scratches and consoles. Appearance has this thing called file nesting, which basically allows you to configure. Let's go to component, pages, no, layout. There we go. So like main layout, if we expand this, we can see there's another file within a file. It just allows you to group those together so you can customize your own if you want, just by going to appearance, file nesting. So that's the Solution Explorer tool window. We'll talk about some of the others shortly. Let's go along the top now. Now, if you go to the top left, we've got this burger menu. Clicking this gives you your top menu that you're probably used to seeing in a Windows application. It might be slightly different if you're using Mac or Linux. I very rarely go to here because I tend to use the keyboard shortcuts for things. You've also got this drop down where you can swap solutions. You can create a new solution or open something. You've got version control. So this isn't in Git at the moment, but you could from here change branches and do various things. We'll talk more about this and local history later on in the course. All of these things we're going to talk about, you can right click and say customize. So you can customize how this toolbar looks. We can start a build. We can do things like change what configuration, whether it's debug or release. If your solution has lots of different projects, you can choose between them here and edit different configurations. So I could do things like changing environment variables or program arguments. You can then run. So if I want to run it, then it's really easy to run this Blazor application we just created. If I do stop, I could do debug, and that would debug into it. Again, we've got a whole section on debugging later on. We can also do things like attach to process, we can profile with timeline and various other things. Next along, so this is something we're going to use an awful lot. Very rarely actually clicking on here because, as you saw in the mouse over, we've got Search Everywhere, Control T. If you're coming from Visual Studio and ReSharper, you'd be very used to Control T. Another shortcut instead of Control T is Shift Shift. Now this pops up this, and this is something you're going to be using a lot because it searches through everything. We've got these tabs along the top so you can be more granular, but let's just stick with it all. So we can search for files. So let's use app.razor for an example. That can find it. You could type in classes or methods or properties. It searches all kind of symbols. You can search for commands in the IDE. So for example, commit, like git commit. You can see here it searches settings, and we've got things like you can actually toggle settings in line without going to the settings dialog. So this is really powerful for finding things. You can even do things like if I type ML, then you can see main layout, it's taken just the capital letters of that word. So if you're searching for something and you kind of like know what words they are, you can kind of like do more fuzzy searching and search for substrings or just the capital letters. So it's very powerful for finding things. So if we collapse some of these panes and let's open one of the files, this cog window here, there's view mode at the bottom. So this allows you to change between a few different view modes, which is quite useful. So there's these like focus modes. So you can do like enter full screen, or if we do Zen mode, so Control Alt Shift Enter, then you kind of get this view where it gets rid of all the different UI and it's like a focus mode. So to Control Alt Shift Enter again to come back. Now obviously we've got the main code editor window here. So you can see along the top there's tabs. If I open a couple of them, you can see there's multiple tabs. You can drag to reorder. I can take one and actually drag it to the side so you can have a split screen view. If I open something else, I can then take that and drag it down. So especially if you've got a really big monitor, this is very useful. I can also drag one off the screen. Let's just drag it off and bring it back. So it's in its own window as well. So that's really powerful if you're working in multiple files at the same time. Looking at so we can see along the side, we've got all of these panes. We've seen Solution Explorer already. We've got services, run, which we saw before. This is the output we saw before. There's a terminal. We open this up. There's various along the right hand side. So we've got like notifications. So you can see we saw that pop up before. It will also tell you about updates and various things. We've got AI Assistant, which we'll be looking at later. Databases, which we'll be looking at later. GitHub Copilot, which is an extension, which we'll also be looking at. Monitoring, and there's various other ones you can choose. If we do this drop down, we can see there's a lot of stuff here, a lot of which we'll be covering as we go through this course. You've got a status bar along the bottom, and this has got various information. We won't go through every single one, but we'll probably cover bits and bobs, like for example, the solution-wide analysis, which we'll definitely be covering later. And then at the bottom right, you get a bit of a status, like for example, showing that the build has succeeded or if it's failed. These tabs, so if I open up just one, for example, let's do services. By default, it's docked and you can resize like this. You've got this ... options. So there's various options. We can't go through them all in this course, but if I go to view mode, we'll see default is docked pinned. So you've got various options here. We can choose dock pinned. If you choose dock unpinned, if I go to the code, that'll go away, where dock pinned it wouldn't have done. Because it says docked, you can see that here we are at the bottom of our file. If I change this to view mode undocked, it's still kind of like docked here, but it's not docked as in the sense of if I click on the code, you can see it's hiding some of our code. We can't actually go to the bottom of our file because this is over the top. And as soon as you click away from it, it'll go away. So that's one option. You've also got the floating window, so that's just a floating window, but it isn't a main window. And lastly, if you choose a window, it becomes an actual window, and it's in the Windows taskbar at the bottom, and it's got the usual. It's a full-fledged Windows window. So if I go back to docked, you can redock it there. So that's useful if you've got other monitors and you want to have different windows in different monitors. Once you're happy with your layout, you can also do, if you do this burger menu, we can do window layout settings, and you can actually save and restore. I believe there's also a plugin to allow you to save and restore named, like different layouts. I can't remember what it's called, but we'll talk about plugins later on in the course. I will leave that as a user exercise to find that plugin if you do want to do that. There's also, with these panes, there's some really nice keyboard shortcuts. If I've got this pane with focus, and this applies to any of the panes, I can do Control, Shift, Alt, and the cursor keys. Now, obviously, substitute Control with Command for mark. But if I do that and then press the up and down arrows, I can from the keyboard very quickly resize stuff. If this has got focus, I can resize this. So that's much nicer than like trying to find the pixel with the mouse and dragging and dropping up. Just being able to do that is much nicer. In fact, let me just change that back to pinned, because that's what the default is. Speaking of shortcuts, a lot of these tool windows have shortcuts. So if I hover over them, a lot of them say like structure is Control Alt and F. We can see Explorer is Control Alt and L, and Explorer is actually Alt and 1 as well. So you can toggle that. So this is quite a nice thing about Rider as well. I think unless it's changed in Visual Studio, there's shortcuts to show things like the Solution Explorer, but it's not a toggle, so you can't show it then get rid of it again. Where a lot of the shortcuts to show these panes in Rider is a toggle, which is quite powerful. There's also, if I just get up one of the panes, if I do Control, Shift and apostrophe, then it toggles it being full screen, that pane, which is quite useful, especially for Git, which we'll look at later because Git has like the log and everything. Another useful shortcut is Control, Shift and F12, which basically collapses all of the panes so you can just see your code window and you can toggle that as well. And the last thing I want to talk about is the settings, and we've already seen here, we can go to settings here. We can do it from this file menu, or you can just press Control, Alt and S. There's a lot of settings. I can't go through all of these, but here we can actually search for them. And as you saw earlier, from the Shift or Control T pop-up where you can search for everything, you can also search for settings. So whilst I'm not going to go through these now, I would recommend just flicking through and getting an idea of what kind of settings you've got in here. You do also have this option at the bottom, backup and sync. So you can sync these options to your account. So that means if you're using Rider on different machines, you can automatically sync those settings and plugins across devices. So that was just a quick speed tour of Rider. We'll obviously cover a lot more detail throughout this course. In the next section, we're going to talk about creating different types of .NET projects. So there's lots of different types of .NET projects. So we're just going to take a look at creating a few different ones. So we've already seen this page before, so we can create a new solution here and we get this pop-up. There are various different options here. So obviously you can start with an empty solution. You've got a console application. So looking at this, you've got the solution name and the project name, where you want it to be stored. You can choose whether you want it to be a Git repository, so it'll do a Git init. So you can choose your target framework. So I can choose .NET 9, which I'll do here, but you can choose past versions if you want, including .NET Framework. You've got choice of language, so C#, F#, or VB.NET. Now note that not all of them, if we go to web, it's not got VB.NET here. So these options will depend on what project type you've selected. There's also various other options like not using top-level statements, adding Docker support. You've got advanced settings. So depending on which one you choose, advanced settings might be different. So let's have a look at web, for example, and let's choose web API. Looking at advanced settings, then you've got things hidden away like use minimal API. Now, in my opinion, that's not an advanced setting, whether to choose minimal API or not. So just bear in mind, there are some different options hidden down here as well. And things like web, you've got other options like authentication, so you can get it to automatically add like B2C support, for example. And then you've also got like other options at the bottom. So all these other options are very dependent on what project type you've selected. So these, for example, are related to the authentication settings. So console application, if I create that, then this is literally just created the console app. So you've got the solution and the project and the program.cs. So this is a very minimal .NET console application. So it's literally just writing hello world. If I go to create a different one, so do this and then new solution. If we look at desktop applications now, then it also supports like Windows applications, so like WPF applications, WinForms. So Rider does actually have a WinForms editor, so like where you can drag and drop and create the forms and layouts and things. It's got the property tool window, the toolbox window, and all of this kind of thing for quickly editing WinForms apps. So that's all in Rider too. If you want to create a cross-platform desktop application, then you've also got Maui, which can do mobile apps and desktop apps. You do have to install the Maui workloads to do that. For web development, we've already seen Web API, but you've got Blazor applications. You can do Blazor WebAssembly. So the Blazor web app is the new .NET 8. Well, not new anymore. So that's using the server-side rendered stuff. And then you've got if you wanted to do like the older style, and because I've chosen .NET 9, these are grayed out. But you've got Blazor Server, Blazor WebAssembly, these older ones. You've also got things like Aspire. So Aspire is obviously out of scope of this course, but if you've not checked it out, it's fairly new, .NET 8, but go check it out. It's so good. And it's quite easy to add like the app host project or the server defaults project using Rider. Rider also has really good integration for Unity. That's out of scope of this course, but just bear in mind that Rider does support Unity development too. So if we open something else, let's just create a Blazor application. So when you create a project and you've already got an existing project open, you'll get this window. Now, whilst it does give you an option for don't ask again, I would strongly recommend not ticking this, because quite often you'll want to choose a different option, this window versus new window, depending on what you're doing at the time. And I'm going to show you in a sec my workflow for opening projects I've already opened in the past. So here I'm going to do this window. So opening up the burger menu and going to open, you do have a history here, but you've got this thing called Manage Recent Solutions. And this pops up this pop-up, and we can see that the previous console app has appeared, and we've got the current Blazor app open we've got here. Now in the next video, I'm going to talk about hotkeys, but just jumping forward, if I go to File, Settings, and then I go to Key Maps, and then search for Manage Projects. Now, by default, this is unassigned. I've assigned it to Alt, Shift, and P, which you can do here. And what this does is this brings up this dialog we've just seen. And in this, we can do various things. So we can right click and say a new project group. Let's call it Don't Train. And then I can move this to that group. So if I've got different areas of projects, I can categorize them here. And then by pressing that shortcut, Shift, Alt, and P, it pops up. And I can very quickly go to it. And using the left or right arrows, I can choose this window or new window. So I can do new window, open it up, and see how fast Rider is launching that. So if I close that, or I can do Control-Shift-P and open it in the current window. And that's launched it. So it's a very quick way of switching applications. So as an example, I've kind of cleared this out for recording this course, but normally because I'm a consultant, I've got multiple clients. So I would have a group for different clients and all those client projects within each group. So it means, and it's searchable as well, it means that I can very quickly find projects and jump between them very quickly. So you've already seen there that one keyboard shortcut can speed things up quite dramatically when switching projects. In the next video, we're going to talk about the 3 big hotkeys in Rider that every developer that uses Rider should know. So I wanted to include a video to talk about keyboard shortcuts. There are a few keyboard shortcuts that you should be using all the time if you're a Rider user. So I want to talk through those key keyboard shortcuts. It's also worth pointing out that throughout this course, I'm going to be saying Control and Alt quite a lot. For the Mac, their equivalents are Command and Option. However, for both time and my sanity's sake, when I mention hotkeys throughout this course, I'm just going to say Control and Alt. If you're a Mac user, then just substitute out those for the Mac equivalent. Also, Rider has a few default presets for keyboard shortcuts. I picked the Visual Studio one. If you've picked a different preset, your keyboard shortcuts might be quite different to mine. Again, for both time and my sanity's sake, every time I mention a keyboard shortcut in this course, I can't every time add a disclaimer that your shortcut might be different to mine. The keyboard shortcuts are very discoverable, so you should easily be able to find your equivalent if you've chosen a different preset layout to me. They're also highly configurable, and you can search and customize your hotkeys to suit you. So let's have a quick look at that first. So if we go back to the settings, again, we can use Control, Alt, and S. So this is the preset I mentioned before. So we've got a few options. I chose Visual Studio because I came from Visual Studio, and we can see that because I've made a few tweaks over time, I've not done a huge amount. And if I've made a change, I will mention that throughout the course. Then it's made like a copy of it. So that happened automatically when I made the first customization. Here you can search for a command. So for example, in the last video where I searched for manage projects, that's easy to find, and we can see what the hotkey is, which is the one I set up in the last video. We can also click here to actually type a shortcut. So that same shortcut, again, finds that command. The other shortcut we've spoken about quite a bit already is Shift-Shift for find everything. If I do Shift-Shift and manage projects, then you can see, again, in line, it shows what the keyboard shortcut is. So the Shift-Shift is really good for discovering hotkeys as well. So now let's talk about the big three hotkeys that I mentioned earlier. So if we start off, I'm going to create a new solution. I'm going to create a web API. And I'm going to open up the controller that gets built. So the first shortcut is Alt-Enter, which is one you'll be using all the time. And again, Options-Enter if you're on the Mac. Now, Alt-Enter does lots of things depending on context. So it's very context aware. You can see in this code, there's a few squigglies. So weather forecast has a green underline. If I put the cursor there, then do Alt-Enter, then we get this drop down with a few things we can do. So we've got like navigation options, we've got changes we can make, but the very top one talks about what this squiggly was. In fact, if we mouse over, the suggestion says convert into primary constructor. So if I Alt-Enter and choose convert to primary constructor, then that has automatically just within that one command changed it over to there. We can see there's another squiggly here. If I hover over that, that says use collection expression, which is a more modern language syntax. Alt-Enter, enter, we can see it's converted it for me. So we can see that these squigglies are really almost teaching me new language syntax as well. And Rider can just do it for me with Alt-Enter. Here's another one. So this isn't a squiggly. I don't have this as a warning, but I quite like expression body members. So this is just doing a return. So there's no need for this to be a return with like the full statement body. So again, context aware, Alt-Enter. I can convert this to an expression body member and it's done it for me. So you can see that Alt-Enter performs actions depending on context, and it does so many different things. Another example, if I add a namespace that isn't used, we can see it's grayed out. So Alt-Enter up here, it says remove unused directives. And with all of these things, you can see there's like a greater than symbol here. So we can choose to do it just this one instance. We can do it throughout the entire folder, the entire project, or globally across the entire solution. So if you're just tidying up and you want to remove all these warnings and code that's not needed, you can make these refactorings across the entire solution, which is very powerful. Another example of Alt-Enter, if I create a new project, I'm going to choose unit test. Now, of course, I'm going to switch over to XUnit and everything else is good. Create. And I go to this test project, which I'm here. We can see that we've got these inline options to be able to run or debug or cover the tests. Because Alt-Enter is context aware, if my cursor is on this line and I press Alt-Enter, then I can do those options from the keyboard without having to reach for the mouse to click. Obviously, there's other ways to run tests. You can run them all together. We'll talk more about testing later on the module. I just wanted to show a few examples of how Alt-Enter can be used in different use cases. This is one of the big three. I will be using this all the time when using Rider and throughout this course. The next one in the big three is Alt-Insert, and this allows you to quickly insert things. So for example, if let's go to a class and I do Alt-Insert, this gives a menu where I can choose some things to insert. Let's go with constructor. And because I've got public properties in the class, it gives me this option. If I didn't have properties or public properties, then it would just do the action straight away. So actually, instead of weather forecast, I'm going to go down here and do Alt-Insert. But because I'm down here, we've now got different options. I can say create a class. Let's call this weather handler. And now if I do Alt-Insert constructor, it's created it for me. And this is really nice because it's left the cursor in the place where I would start injecting dependencies. Another shortcut, if I just delete these three, I can do ctor and then press the tab key, and that does that. But this one leaves the cursor here, where actually quite often if I'm adding a constructor, I want the cursor to be here. So that Alt-Insert, I personally prefer because it means I don't then have to move the cursor to here to inject like iLogger or whatever it is. Other uses for Alt-Insert, so we've seen creating a class, created the constructor. Remember, this also is context aware. So say we go over to the solution. So this has got focus and I press Alt-Insert, then We can choose like a new project or a new solution folder or a new Scratch file. Again, we'll talk about Scratch files later on. You can attach existing folders and things. If we go down to an actual project level and do Alt Insert, then we get all of these and we can create files and directories and all of these different types of things. So you can see that Alt Insert is a very powerful command, just like Alt Enter, which you can incorporate a lot into your workflow to speed things up. And the third of the big three, we've already seen Shift or Control T, whichever you prefer. And this does everything. I've already spoken about this. There are shortcuts to open these up, but to be honest, I never use those. I always just use all because you can find everything. And as I've mentioned, this includes things like files, symbols, so like methods or properties or class names. You can do fuzzy matching. So for weather forecast, I could do WF to find it. Weather forecast controller, WFC. So I can very quickly find things. I can search for commands, so like commit, build. I can build solution and various things. We can see that commands that have shortcuts are very discoverable here. We can search for things like settings. So if I do theme, I can then go to this setting and it will open this up directly from that Shift command. And I will avoid switching to light mode because that will blind you all. So we'll show a lot more use cases of these three shortcuts throughout the course. In this video, I've just shown a few examples to give you a taste of what they do. Also, obviously, there are a lot more shortcuts than these three, but I see these ones as being the core hotkeys that you'll be using all the time. I'm personally a big fan of Vim, which takes learning keyboard shortcuts to the next level. From my experience learning keyboard shortcuts, my advice would be to pick just a couple of new ones and intentionally start to use those when you're coding. Then before learning any more, first get to the point where you're using those shortcuts subconsciously without thinking about it. Then add a couple more to your workflow, then build up that way. You really want to aim to be using these shortcuts automatically without thinking about it. And doing this makes a huge difference to your productivity when coding.